All right, folks, let's settle in and take a journey back together. For many of us who grew up in the years after the Second World War, the late 40s and the 1950s were a really unique time in America, weren't they? On one hand, there was this incredible sense of optimism. The war was over, the economy was booming, for many families were growing, and technology seemed poised to solve all our problems. We were entering the jet age, cars were getting flashier, televisions were starting to appear in living rooms, and the promise of atomic energy, despite its terrifying power, also hinted at a future of limitless possibilities. We were looking upwards towards the skies, dreaming of conquering space long before Sputnik beeped its way across the night sky. But beneath that shiny surface, there was also a deep current of anxiety running through the country. Wasn't there? The Cold War was casting a long, chilling shadow. We lived with the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation, the fear of Soviet espionage. The Red Scare kids were practicing duck and cover drills in schools. It was a time when the unknown often felt threatening, when people were perhaps quicker to see danger lurking in the shadows or even in the skies above. And it was precisely into this atmosphere that something new, something puzzling began to appear. Reports started surfacing, first a trickle, then more and more of people seeing things flying overhead that they simply couldn't identify. These weren't just fleeting glimpses. Sometimes they were detailed accounts from credible observers. Commercial airline pilots, military aviators whose very job was to know what belonged in the sky, police officers, and just regular folks out in their backyards. They described objects moving at incredible speeds, making hairpin turns that would defy the laws of physics as we understood them for any conventional aircraft, hovering silently or sometimes accelerating instantaneously and vanishing from sight. There were strange lights, discs, cigar shapes, you name it. What on earth was going on? Given the Cold War tensions, the first thought for many in charge was, naturally, could these be advanced Soviet aircraft, maybe spy planes? Or were they something else? Something stranger? The public was getting restless. The media picked up on the stories, and the Air Force realized they couldn't just ignore it. They needed to investigate, to categorize, and crucially, to reassure the American people that they had a handle on whatever was happening in our airspace. This led directly to the formation of Project Blue Book in 1952, building on earlier, less formalized investigations. It became the official public face of the Air Force's effort to study these unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. But to lend the project an air of scientific legitimacy, they couldn't just rely on military analysts. They needed someone with unimpeachable scientific credentials. That someone turned out to be Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Now, Hynek wasn't some fringe character. He was a serious academic, an astronomer and astrophysicist at Ohio State University. Later, the chairman of the astronomy department at Northwestern University. He was a man thoroughly grounded in the scientific method in observation, calculation, and logical deduction. He understood the cosmos through the lens of physics and mathematics. Vast, yes, but ultimately understandable and governed by predictable laws. When the Air Force tapped him to serve as the chief scientific consultant for Blue Book, his perspective was precisely what you'd hire a skeptic for. He was convinced quite reasonably, from his standpoint, that there had to be conventional explanations for virtually all these sightings. He approached the task methodically. Reports would come in, often filled out on standardized forms, detailing time, location, duration appearance, movement of the object to weather conditions, and witness background. Hynek's job was to meticulously review the data, particularly cases that weren't immediately obvious, and apply his scientific expertise. Could that bright light simply be the planet Venus exceptionally brilliant under certain atmospheric conditions? Could that fast-moving object have been a meteor, maybe a fireball breaking up? Was that strange shape a weather balloon caught in high-altitude winds, or perhaps an optical illusion caused by a temperature inversion, maybe even sunlight reflecting off ice crystals high in the atmosphere? He considered lenticular clouds, mirages, even conventional aircraft misidentified under unusual circumstances or seen from odd angles. Later on, as secret projects like the U-2 spy plane started flying at altitudes previously unheard of, those too became a potential explanation for some high-altitude sightings. Hynek's role was essential for Blue Book's public credibility. He could analyze star charts, calculate trajectories, assess visibility conditions. He brought the weight of academic astronomy to the table, and for a considerable time, he found that many, indeed, most reports could be plausibly assigned to one of these mundane categories. There was a certain comfort in that, both for him as a scientist who believed in an orderly universe, and for the Air Force, which needed to project an image of control and understanding. Finding a conventional explanation meant closing the file, another mystery solved, another potentially worrying incident neutralized. But the sheer, unrelenting flood of reports and the stubborn persistence of a small percentage that seemed to defy every conventional explanation he could muster began to plant seeds of doubt, suggesting that perhaps the universe wasn't quite as predictable as his textbooks had led him to believe. The neat boxes he was trying to fit these reports into sometimes felt inadequate. Okay, so Dr. Hynek, this highly respected astronomer, is diligently working away for the Air Force on Project Blue Book, applying his scientific mind to these baffling UFO reports. As we talked about for years, he was largely successful in finding conventional explanations, identifying Venus meteors, weather balloons, and the like. He was the voice of scientific reason, helping to categorize, and let's be frank, often debunk sightings that were causing public concern. But imagine being in his shoes. You're a scientist trained to look for patterns for consistency, but also for anomalies, things that don't fit the established models. While the vast majority of cases, maybe 90 or 95%, could eventually be squeezed into some sort of conventional box, there was this persistent residue, a small percentage of cases that just wouldn't cooperate. These weren't just blurry lights. Sometimes they were detailed accounts from multiple credible witnesses describing structured craft performing maneuvers that seemed impossible for any known technology, certainly anything publicly known in the 1950s and early 60s. These were the cases that started to nag at him, the ones that kept him up at night perhaps. It wasn't just the data points on a form that began to sway him, though a crucial part of this story, something that likely played a huge role in his gradual change of heart, was the human element. Dr. Hynek wasn't just sitting in an office looking at charts. His role sometimes involved interviewing the witnesses themselves. Think about that for a moment. It's one thing to read a dry report, but it's quite another to sit across from a seasoned airline pilot, someone responsible for hundreds of lives, and hear him describe with bewilderment or even fear in his voice an object that paced his aircraft and then shot off at unbelievable speed. or talking to a police officer trained to be observant and level-headed who recounts a silent, glowing object hovering over a field. Hynek started encountering people from all walks of life: farmers, teachers, business people, entire families, who were clearly intelligent, sincere, and profoundly affected by what they had seen. He had to look them in the eye and reconcile their genuine testimony with his scientific skepticism. He famously started asking himself, "How long can I keep calling these people crazy?" He realized these weren't just errors in perception. These were deeply felt human experiences. This growing respect for the witnesses stood in increasingly stark contrast to what he began to perceive as the inherent limitations and perhaps even biases of Project Blue Book itself. True scientific inquiry thrives on investigating the unknown, on admitting when you don't have an answer, and on rigorously pursuing anomalies. But Hynek started to feel that Blue Book often operated under a different imperative: to find an explanation, almost any explanation, rather than classify a case as genuinely unknown. He saw a tendency to stretch conventional explanations thin, to grasp at straws, perhaps under pressure from higher-ups who simply wanted the UFO problem to go away. He noted the lack of resources for thorough field investigations, the insufficient follow-up on promising leads, and a general atmosphere that discouraged taking the more bizarre reports too seriously. He even later lamented specific instances, like a case in Idaho involving multiple family members seeing an object descend into a canyon, which he initially went along with classifying as a natural phenomenon for the official report, only to regret it profoundly years later, feeling he should have stood firmer and acknowledged the strangeness of the account. He began to see that the project wasn't truly designed to solve the mystery, but perhaps more to manage public perception of it. It was more about public relations, he suspected, than pure science. This created a significant internal conflict for him. His scientific integrity pushed him to acknowledge the truly puzzling cases, the signal buried within the overwhelming noise of misidentifications. Yet his role as an Air Force consultant, and perhaps his own ingrained skepticism, still held him back from fully embracing the extraordinary possibilities. He wasn't ready to jump to conclusions about extraterrestrial visitors, not by a long shot, but he was becoming increasingly convinced that something real, something beyond conventional science's grasp at the time, was happening. This wasn't an overnight epiphany. It was a slow burn, a gradual accumulation of evidence and experience over nearly 2 decades. He started arguing internally, pushing back against flimsy explanations, advocating for more thorough investigations, and perhaps becoming a bit of a thorn in the side of some of his Air Force liaisons. He was still Dr. Hynek, the astronomer, but the certainty of his initial skepticism was giving way to the unsettling, challenging, and ultimately scientifically exciting possibility that we weren't just dealing with weather balloons and Venus anymore. The universe, it seemed, might be throwing us a curveball, and Project Blue Book, he feared, was dropping the catch. This growing disillusionment would eventually set the stage for a major shift in his life and work. Okay, so we have Dr. Hynek, this dedicated astronomer, finding himself increasingly at odds with the very project he was hired to consult for Project Blue Book. He saw too many credible reports, too many sincere witnesses, and too many instances where puzzling evidence seemed to be swept under the rug in favor of flimsy explanations. He was growing convinced that something genuinely anomalous was occurring, something that deserved far more rigorous scientific attention than the Air Force seemed willing or perhaps even able, given its constraints, to provide. This internal struggle, this growing disconnect between the official mandate and the reality of the reports he was seeing couldn't last forever. And indeed, it didn't. In 1969, the Air Force officially shut down Project Blue Book. After nearly 2 decades and investigating over 12,000 sightings, the official conclusion was announced. No UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force was ever an indication of threat to our national security. There was no evidence submitted to or discovered by the Air Force that sightings categorized as unidentified represented technological developments or principles beyond the range of present-day scientific knowledge. And there was no evidence indicating that sightings categorized as unidentified were extraterrestrial vehicles. Case closed right for the Air Force. That was the final word. The book was literally closed on UFOs as far as official public investigation was concerned. But for Dr. Hynek, this wasn't an ending. It felt more like a beginning, or perhaps a confirmation of his deepest concerns. He felt this official conclusion, this neat wrapping up of a complex and often baffling phenomenon, was not only premature, but potentially misleading, even dishonest. He knew about the cases that didn't fit the ones classified as unknown, that genuinely defied explanation. How could the Air Force declare no threat and nothing beyond present-day science when faced with such persistent anomalies reported by highly credible people? What truly solidified this conviction for Hynek, and what adds a chilling layer to this whole story, were incidents that allegedly occurred during the time Blue Book was active, incidents that struck at the very heart of national security. Events involving our nuclear weapons arsenal. While the final Blue Book report claimed no threat, there were people, military personnel sworn to secrecy for decades, who knew a different story. Let's focus on one particularly stark example: Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, March 1967. This was deep in the Cold War. Folks, Malmstrom was home to dozens of Minuteman nuclear missile silos buried beneath the prairie, the tip of America's strategic spear missiles, ready to launch at a moment's notice upon presidential order. We're talking about the absolute highest level of security. Serving there were young officers like First Lieutenant Robert Salas, a missile launch officer, and Lieutenant Robert Jameson, a targeting officer. Their accounts, corroborated by others, paint an astonishing picture. One night, reports came in from frantic security guards topside about strange, silent, glowing reddish-orange lights hovering near the missile sites, particularly near the front gate of one launch facility. The guards were terrified, some reportedly shouting and babbling into their radios. Salas, deep underground in the reinforced concrete launch control capsule, initially dismissed the reports. But then the impossible happened. On his control panel, one by one, the status lights for the 10 nuclear missiles under his command switched from green go or launch ready to red no go, indicating a system malfunction or shutdown. 10 independent nuclear missiles simultaneously became unlaunchable. Think about the implications. If the order to launch had come down from the president at that moment, those missiles would not have flown. Some unseen thing hovering overhead appeared to have interfered with and disabled America's nuclear deterrent. No conventional explanation held water. These were hardened systems designed to withstand EMP from a nuclear blast operating independently. For all 10 to fail simultaneously due to an internal fault was considered technically impossible, yet it happened. And what followed, according to those involved, like Salas and Jameson, a swift clamp down. They were debriefed by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. AFOSI told the incident never happened and forced to sign non-disclosure agreements forbidding them from ever speaking about it. For decades, they carried this secret, and this wasn't an isolated event. A similar incident involving missile shutdowns coinciding with UFO sightings was reported by personnel like Captain David Schindel at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. The previous year, 1966, these weren't just lights in the sky. These were direct physical interactions with our most sensitive military hardware witnessed by trained military officers, and then allegedly, systematically covered up. Learning about events like these, even if the full details only emerged publicly much later, cemented Dr. Hynek's belief. The official story, the Blue Book conclusion, simply didn't square with these terrifying and classified realities. If the government wasn't going to investigate this phenomenon honestly and openly, then someone else had to. The mystery was too profound and the potential implications too significant to simply let it be buried under denials and classified files. So imagine the situation in the early 1970s. Project Blue Book, the government's official, albeit flawed investigation into UFOs, is shut down. The official word is nothing to see here, folks. No threat, nothing unexplainable by conventional means. But behind the scenes, stories like the chilling events at Malmstrom Air Force Base, where nuclear missiles were mysteriously disabled by hovering lights, are being whispered about by those forced into silence. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who spent nearly 2 decades consulting for Blue Book, knows the official conclusion doesn't tell the whole story. He's seen too much, heard too many credible accounts, and developed too deep a respect for the witnesses to simply accept the government's dismissal. He's convinced that there's a real significant phenomenon at play, one that demands serious, objective scientific scrutiny. The very scrutiny he felt Blue Book failed to provide. What does a man of science, a man of integrity, do in such a position? He doesn't just shrug and go back to his observatory full-time. No, Dr. Hynek felt compelled to act. The closure of Blue Book created a void, a vacuum where serious organized UFO research should have been, and he decided he needed to help fill it. In 1974, drawing on his reputation and his network of contacts, Dr. Hynek founded the Center for UFO Studies, or CUFOS. This wasn't meant to be just another club for enthusiasts. Hynek envisioned it as a civilian scientific organization independent of government control and committed to applying rigorous methods to the study of UFO reports. He gathered around him other scientists, academics, engineers, and dedicated researchers who shared his conviction that the phenomenon deserved serious attention. People like Mark Rodegear, who eventually became Hynek's successor at CUFOS, described the early days. It wasn't some fancy, well-funded institute. For a time, its headquarters was literally in the basement of Rodegear's home. They operated as many pioneering efforts do on passion, dedication, and probably not much sleep. The mission of CUFOS was threefold. First, to be a credible, reliable place where people could report their sightings without fear of immediate ridicule. They even established a nationwide hotline, distributing the number widely and asking police departments to pass it along. Second, CUFOS aimed to disseminate reliable information, publishing journals and monographs based on careful analysis trying to cut through the sensationalism and misinformation that often surrounded the topic. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they aimed to conduct actual research, to build databases, analyze patterns, and apply scientific methodologies to try and understand the nature of the phenomenon. They even embarked on ambitious projects like working with the renowned researcher Jacques Vallée to create one of the first computerized databases of UFO reports, compiling thousands of cases from Air Force files and other sources, while Kufos worked diligently behind the scenes on the research front. Dr. Hynek himself stepped further into the public spotlight. He became a familiar face on television talk shows and a frequent voice on radio programs throughout the 1970s. He wasn't a wild-eyed true believer. He presented himself as a careful scientist who, through long experience, had become convinced that something significant was being overlooked. He wrote his seminal book, The UFO Experience, A Scientific Inquiry, published in 1972, which laid out his reasoning, his methodology for classifying sightings, famously introducing the close encounters scale, and argued passionately for taking witness testimony seriously. He spoke about the human experience of these encounters, emphasizing that you couldn't simply dismiss the profound impact these events had on ordinary people. This public advocacy was crucial in an era after the moon landing when fascination with space and the possibilities of science fiction were running high, and perhaps a healthy dose of skepticism towards official government narratives lingered from the Vietnam and Watergate years. Hynek offered a credible scientific voice discussing a topic many found fascinating, but few in authority would touch. He gave people permission in a way to take the subject seriously. Of course, it wasn't easy. He and Kufos faced constant challenges: limited funding, skepticism from the broader scientific community that still largely considered UFOs taboo, and relentless criticism from debunkers. But Hynek's calm demeanor, his scientific credentials, and his persistent, reasoned arguments earned him considerable respect, even from many who didn't fully share his conclusions. His steady presence arguing for careful investigation over dismissal or sensationalism was building a new foundation for studying the UFO mystery. And it wasn't long before his unique perspective caught the eye of someone who could bring the phenomenon to an even wider audience, someone in Hollywood. All right, so Dr. Hynek has successfully transitioned from a skeptical Air Force consultant to the leading public voice advocating for a serious scientific look at UFOs. He's founded QFOS, the Center for UFO Studies. He's appearing on television and radio, and he's published The UFO Experience, laying out his classifications and approach. He's making waves, presenting a calm, reasoned argument that this phenomenon, whatever it is, deserves our attention. And it turns out someone very influential was paying attention. Someone who had a unique power to shape public imagination, a young, immensely talented filmmaker named Steven Spielberg. In the mid-1970s, Spielberg was already a rising star, but he had an idea for a different kind of science fiction movie. Think about most sci-fi films back then, especially those dealing with visitors from space. Often, it was about invasion, destruction, us versus them. Think War of the Worlds or countless B-movies. Spielberg envisioned something else, something focused not on conflict, but on wonder, mystery, communication, and the profound, perhaps even unsettling impact such an encounter would have on ordinary people. He wanted to capture the awe and the yearning for contact. To bring this vision to life with a sense of realism, Spielberg needed more than just special effects. He needed grounding in the actual research and theories surrounding UFOs. He came across Dr. Hynek's work, particularly his book, and was deeply impressed by the scientific approach and the compelling classification system Hynek had developed. Here was a respected astronomer, treating the subject seriously, meticulously documenting witness accounts, and trying to make sense of the phenomenon. This was exactly the kind of input Spielberg was looking for. He didn't just read the book. He sought out Dr. Hynek personally and hired him as a key scientific and technical consultant for his ambitious new film, which would eventually be titled Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Hynek's role wasn't just window dressing. Spielberg genuinely wanted his expertise to infuse the film with a degree of authenticity, or at least scientifically informed speculation. Hynek shared insights from real cases investigated by Blue Book and CUFOS, discussed patterns in sightings, the typical behavior of witnesses, the confusion, the obsession, the fear, the wonder, and even speculative scientific concepts that were being considered in relation to UFO reports. Things like apparent hypersonic speeds, instantaneous acceleration, gravitational effects, even potential biological impacts like the strange sunburn effect seen on one side of Richard Dreyfuss's character's face in the movie. The goal, as Hynek saw it, was to help make the film credible within its own speculative framework. Spielberg didn't stop with Hynek. He also consulted with another giant in the field, the French computer scientist and UFO researcher Jacques Vallée had worked closely with Hynek on building that early UFO database and brought his own unique, often more unconventional perspectives to the table. This collaboration added another layer of depth, and the character of the French scientist leading the international research team in the film, Lacombe, played by François Truffaut, was loosely inspired by Vallée himself. Having this international scientific perspective embedded in the film's narrative further elevated it beyond typical Hollywood fare. But the film's very title and its central structure came directly from Dr. Hynek's work. Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Hynek had defined a close encounter of the first kind as a simple sighting of a UFO. A close encounter of the second kind involved physical evidence, landing traces, electromagnetic effects, things like that. And the most profound and controversial, a close encounter of the third kind involved sighting the occupants, the beings associated with the craft. The film brilliantly dramatized these concepts, taking the audience through the escalating stages of encounter and mystery. Released in 1977, Close Encounters of the Third Kind was a massive cultural phenomenon. It was visually stunning, emotionally resonant, and critically acclaimed. More than just a box office success, it fundamentally shifted the public conversation around UFOs. It presented the possibility of contact not as inherently terrifying, but as something potentially awe-inspiring, something that could unite humanity in a shared sense of wonder. Thanks to the film, Dr. Hynek's terminology, close encounter, became a household phrase forever embedded in our popular lexicon. The film also catapulted Hynek himself to a new level of fame. He was no longer just a scientist known within UFO circles. He was the real-life expert behind this blockbuster movie. Spielberg even paid tribute by giving Dr. Hynek a cameo appearance in the film's climactic final scene at Devil's Tower. You can spot him bearded and pipe-smoking, looking on in appropriate scientific awe as the mothership descends. While it was, of course, a work of fiction, Close Encounters, heavily informed by Hynek's decades of research and his insistence on taking the phenomenon seriously, managed to capture that elusive blend of fear, wonder, and profound mystery that Hynek believed lay at the heart of the genuine UFO experience. It brought his perspective, his life's work, to millions, in a way no academic paper or lecture ever could. But even as Hollywood was exploring fictional encounters, the real-world reports continued leading Hynek and Kufos to investigate new waves of sightings that were just as baffling as anything that had come before. Okay, so Close Encounters of the Third Kind, inspired heavily by Dr. Hynek's work, brought the mystery and wonder of UFOs to millions on the big screen in 1977. It made Close Encounter a household phrase and solidified Hynek as the go-to scientific voice on the subject. But the real world doesn't stop just because Hollywood makes a movie. The sightings continued. People kept seeing things they couldn't explain, and Dr. Hynek, through his Center for UFO Studies, Kufos, remained dedicated to investigating these reports, still searching for answers long after the government had officially washed its hands of the matter. And in the early 1980s, one of the most significant and baffling waves of sightings in modern American history began to unfold not far from New York City, in the Hudson Valley region, primarily over Westchester and Putnam counties. Starting around 1983 and lasting for several years, literally thousands of people reported seeing something truly extraordinary in their night skies. What was described time and again by independent witnesses who often didn't know each other was astonishingly consistent. It was typically described as a massive object, often V-shaped or boomerang-shaped, sometimes compared in size to a football field, vastly larger than any conventional aircraft. It was adorned with numerous lights, often very bright, sometimes changing colors. But perhaps the two most consistently reported characteristics were its movement and its sound, or rather, lack thereof. These enormous objects were seen moving incredibly slowly, sometimes just drifting or hovering silently over towns, highways, and even backyards. Completely silent. Think about that. Anything remotely that large moving, that slowly built with our known technology, would be making a tremendous amount of noise. Yet witness after witness emphasized the unnerving silence. People pulled their cars over on the Taconic Parkway to watch. Police departments were flooded with calls. One witness, the chief meteorologist at the Westchester County Airport with 25 years of experience, described seeing it pass slowly overhead like a docking ship. People weren't just glancing up. They were having prolonged sightings, often feeling a mixture of awe, disbelief, and undeniable fear. As one local police chief involved at the time said, seeing it overhead so large and silent made him instantly worry about his family and how to even process what he was witnessing. Now you'd think that thousands of reports, including from law enforcement, about gigantic silent objects cruising over populated areas near a major metropolis would trigger a massive, serious investigation from the FAA or the Air Force, wouldn't you? But astonishingly, that didn't happen. There was no major official inquiry, no satisfying explanation offered to the thousands of bewildered residents. Instead, what eventually emerged as the semi-official explanation, promoted in some media outlets like Discover magazine, was almost insulting to those who had seen the object firsthand It was supposedly just a group of local pilots flying ultralight aircraft in formation at night as a deliberate hoax. The witnesses and local investigators who had spent countless hours interviewing them were adamant. This explanation was impossible. Ultralights are small, very noisy, and couldn't possibly account for the sheer size, the absolute silence, and the slow, controlled movements described by so many credible people. As one investigator put it, "You hear engines. Ultralights fly here constantly. Have you heard 7,000 people say, 'I saw ultralights'?" No, it had to be something else. But the damage was done. The convenient, dismissive explanation allowed the authorities to close the book, and it cast doubt on the witnesses, effectively sweeping one of the most witnessed UFO events ever under the rug. It was into this situation that Dr. J. Allen Hynek himself arrived in 1984. This wave of sightings, given the number and quality of the witnesses and the consistency of the descriptions, deeply intrigued him. He traveled to the Hudson Valley, met with witnesses, visited sighting locations, and did what he always did best. He listened respectfully. He didn't just ask what they saw. He asked how they felt, what their instincts told them. For people who had seen something incredible only to be ignored or implicitly called liars or fools, by the official explanation, having a respected scientist like Dr. Hynek come and take their experiences seriously was profoundly validating. He was reportedly deeply impressed by the case, seeing it as compelling evidence for the reality of the phenomenon. This Hudson Valley investigation turned out to be one of the last major cases Hynek personally delved into before his passing in 1986. It stood as a powerful testament to the fact that the UFO mystery was far from over, despite official denials. Similar waves of sightings, like the well-documented Belgian wave involving triangular craft tracked on radar by their military just a few years later, further underscored that this was a persistent global phenomenon, often met with baffling silence or denial in some official quarters, while being taken very seriously in others. Conclusion starts here. So, looking back at this journey, what do we make of it all? We've followed the path of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a man who started as a firm skeptic, applying his scientific mind to debunk UFO reports for the Air Force, only to be confronted by persistent, baffling evidence and credible human testimony that led him to dedicate the latter part of his life to advocating for serious investigation. His story is a reminder that true scientific integrity sometimes means questioning our assumptions and being willing to pursue uncomfortable truths. We've heard about Project Blue Book and the lingering questions about whether the full story was ever told. We've touched upon the truly disturbing accounts from Malmstrom Air Force Base, where military officers witnessed unidentified objects seemingly interfere with nuclear missiles, accounts that directly contradict the official narrative of no threat. We saw how Hynek's work influenced popular culture through close encounters, bringing a sense of wonder to a topic often shrouded in fear or ridicule. And we've seen how, even after all that, events like the massive Hudson Valley sightings continued, witnessed by thousands, yet largely dismissed by official channels. There are clearly no easy answers here. The UFO phenomenon remains one of the most perplexing and polarizing mysteries of our time. Was Hynek right? Are we dealing with technologies far beyond our own, perhaps visitors from elsewhere, or something even stranger we can't yet comprehend? Or are there more complex, perhaps terrestrial explanations for everything obscured by secrecy, misidentification, and the very human tendency to see patterns where none exist? What seems clear from this history, though, is that dismissing the thousands of credible reports out of hand, or ridiculing the sincere experiences of ordinary people, doesn't get us any closer to the truth. Dr. Hynek's ultimate legacy might be his insistence that we approach the unknown not with fear or dismissal, but with curiosity, rigor, and respect for the evidence wherever it may lead. The questions he raised decades ago about transparency, scientific openness, and the nature of reality itself still resonate today, perhaps more strongly than ever. What do you think about Dr. Hynek's journey and the events we've discussed? Do you remember any of these times? Perhaps even saw something yourself? We'd love to hear your thoughts and respectful discussion in the comments below. If you found this exploration interesting and want to delve into more compelling stories and unanswered questions, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel. Thanks so much for joining us today, and until next time, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.